Star Trek The Next Generation, Starfleet Academy, Worf's First Adventure, Chapter 1. The young Klingon saw it before anyone else. He squinted against the sun for a moment while his brother was still deep in conversation with her parents. Then he stabbed a finger in the air and said, "There!" The three humans turned to see where he was indicating.
"There," said the father. "I don't. No, wait, he's right. There it comes."
The shuttle transport dropped gracefully from the sky, actually seeming to flutter over the Russian landscape like a feather in the breeze. Now that it was in view, it approached with startling speed. One moment it was no larger than a penny against the sun, and the next it was cruising directly overhead, angling down toward the landing pad some yards away. Technicians were already scrambling to meet and service the vehicle, prepping it for the continuation of its voyage. Young Worf Rozhenko turned to face his parents. They were so beaming with pride that if they had been sons, he would have been blinded by the light. What was the word he'd heard his foster mother use? Kveling. Sounded vaguely Klingonese, but his mother insisted it was some ancient tongue called Yiddish. Sergei Rozhenko, his adopted father, was a robust, barrel-chested man. His hair and beard were showing the first serious signs of graying. At first, Sergei had refused to believe the alteration in the coloring of his hair, claiming loudly and repeatedly that no Rozhenko male had ever gone gray. Then one day, Worf had simply pointed out that no Rozhenko male had ever had to deal with raising a young Klingon. This caused 5 minutes of hysterical laughter from both his parents. He would never forget Sergei Rozhenko slapping his knee and pointing and saying, "You're right, Worf. You're absolutely right. If every Rozhenko father had to deal with a Klingon son, he'd be gray by 30 and bald by 40. His father was a strong man, both physically and temperamentally. His mother, Helena, was just as strong, but in a different way. Where Sergei was boisterous, Helena was reserved. Where Sergei was demanding, Helena was persuasive. They complemented each other perfectly, and between the two of them could accomplish just about anything. Next to Worf stood his brother, Simon. Worf did not need to guess what his father had looked like when he was a young man. Simon was the image of him. He was beardless, revealing the strong jawline that their father's facial growth hid. But he had the same black hair, the same ready smile, and the same confident, gleaming eyes. The only real difference was that he had the smaller, more delicate nose of Helena, which almost looked like something of a mismatch in the otherwise rugged face. Sergei loudly proclaimed that sooner or later the boy would be in a good, solid brawl, get his nose broken, and look just like his father, a notion about which Helena was not particularly enthusiastic. Technically, Worf should have been thinking of Simon as his adopted brother, but never in all the years that they'd been together, and Worf had difficulty remembering now a time when they hadn't been. Simon had never done anything to make Worf feel as if he were anything less than a full-fledged, full-blooded member of the Rozhenko family. Nor had Sergei and Helena Rozhenko themselves. And yet, there had been those others. Worf's scowl deepened in that way that his mother had come to recognize instantly. Her first emotional response was to embrace her Klingon son, crush him to her, assure him that everything was going to be better now, that the public school taunts Worf had endured throughout his childhood and into his teens would be a thing of the past. But she knew him too well. She knew that such words of encouragement were not what he wanted to hear. All those times when he had come home after having been in yet another fight, he had not wanted or desired consolation.
"It is not appropriate, Mother,"
he had said to her so often that she knew every word by heart.
"A warrior endures pain without complaint. Nothing less is to be expected."
"But you're not a warrior," she had once replied in frustration. "You're a boy, nowhere near grown, and you're hurting, even if you don't want to admit it. Don't shut me up, Worf." But he had, because he was Klingon. No, simply the way things were. It had taken her a long time to come to terms with that, She had finally managed to, though, or at least she thought she had. Still, when she saw her son, Simon, embracing his father, hugging the older man with such strength that it seemed as if he might snap him in half, just for a moment she wanted to fold Worf into her arms, hold her adopted Klingon son one more time before he went off to Starfleet Academy to become a man. But she held herself back. Instead, drawing herself up stiffly, she extended a hand. "Good luck, Worf," she said. Just for a moment, she was certain that she saw a fleeting look of gratitude in his eyes. An emotional display, while being very fulfilling for her, would have been tremendously embarrassing for him. He took the hand and shook it firmly.
"Thank you, Mother."
Unable to help herself, she added, "Don't let your hair grow too long. You're always arguing about that."
Worf made a humph noise. "A true Klingon warrior's hair is long, and preferably uncombed."
His father glanced at him, relaxing his embrace on Simon.
"If you're in the Klingon Empire," he said firmly, "you can be as unkempt as you like. But," he rumbled, "when you're in Starfleet, you'll abide by the codes of appearance. You understand that, don't you, Worf?"
The phrasing was not a question, and clearly only one answer was acceptable.
"Yes, Father,"
replied Worf. It was a bit easier for his father to resist hugging him. His father had once been in Starfleet, and formality on special occasions came naturally to him. He shook Worf's hand firmly, and even managed not to wince at the strength of the boy's grip. The shuttlecraft had landed, and technicians were getting flight updates from the pilot. Through one of the shuttle windows, Worf caught a glimpse of a young woman with pointed ears and upswept eyebrows. Unmistakably, she was a Vulcan, and Worf felt a brief rush of excitement. He'd never seen one before, and now he'd be attending class at Starfleet Academy with one. There was someone else at another window, and this individual drew a frown from Worf. It was a human boy with short-cropped red hair. For reasons that Worf could not guess, the youth was staring intently at the window, touching the tip of his nose with his finger. He would then bring his finger slowly to the window, touch the window, and then return it to his nose. As Worf watched, the young man did it 3 times, apparently oblivious to the oddness of his behavior. Mentally, Worf shrugged. Who could understand the mysteries of humans? He had lived among them for almost as long as he could remember, first on the farming planet of Galt, and then on Earth, in Russia, since he was 11 years of age. The time spent with his Klingon parents on the now-destroyed colony of Khitomer seemed more and more frequently a mere dream that was fading fast, a dream that he often had to fight to hold on to. There was nothing more to say. He nodded formally to his parents, picked up his bag, and headed for the shuttle. Simon started to follow, but Helena put a hand on his shoulder. In a low voice, she said, "Watch out for your brother, Simon. Make certain he's all right."
"Of course, Mother," he said, sounding a bit puzzled. "But Worf has always been rather self-sufficient, don't you think? He doesn't need a babysitter."
"No, but he does need support. He needs to know that he has someone to turn to. Even strong people need to draw strength from those around them. Be there for him to lean on, Simon." She kissed him on the cheek. "I'm counting on you."
"Don't worry so, Helena," Sergei boomed in his most confident voice. "The Rozhenko brothers, together at Starfleet Academy. What possible obstacle could arise that they would not be able to handle, eh?"
Simon smiled readily, as he so often did. "Nothing, Father," he said. But as he headed toward the shuttlecraft, he felt the first pang of unease. He glanced back to see his parents waving and his father giving him a confident thumbs up. He hoped that he could remain as confident as his father. There were 2 empty seats on the shuttle. Worf took the one toward the back. His reflex. Worf had long ago gotten into the habit of sitting at the farthest point from the door in any room, preferably with his back against a wall. This made it impossible for anyone to sneak up and attack him from behind. The fact that there was little likelihood that he would be ambushed on a low-orbit shuttlecraft made no difference. Habit was habit. The seat put him directly across the aisle from the young Vulcan woman he had glimpsed earlier. She was rather intriguing looking. In addition to the exotic aspect of her ears and eyebrows, Her black, longish hair was tied back in a tail and held there by an odd, triangular-shaped gold barrette. Worf was caught by its gleam and stared at it rather openly. Simon, for his part, was seated opposite the oddball with the window fixation. He had ceased his strange window-to-nose-and-back ritual. Instead, he brought his mouth right up to the window, opened wide, and puffed on it, creating a small circle of moisture that misted the window over. He then began to etch some sort of numbers and equations in it, all with a very distracted air. The shuttlecraft door closed with a thud. Moments after running some last-minute safety checks, the craft lifted into the air. It angled around, and Worf, peering through his own window, was able to spot his parents. They were standing exactly where they had been before. They were still waving, as if they were wind-up mechanical dolls. From this height, he doubted they could see him, and, for all they knew, he could not see them. But somehow, it clearly didn't matter to them. They would probably stand there and wave until their arms fell off, and it didn't matter. He had a feeling that they would continue to wave until the shuttlecraft was long, long out of sight, and perhaps even for a few moments after that. As if waving would put off for a little while longer the inevitability of being left alone after nearly 2 decades of raising children. He sighed for a moment, and then turned his silent attention back to the Vulcan woman. She appeared intent on some text that she was reading. He glanced over at it and saw that it was in a language he didn't recognize, probably Vulcan. So he went back to studying the odd clip in her hair. Without looking up, she said, "It's an idic." He blinked in surprise.
What?
"The symbol holding my hair back. It's called an idic." For the first time, she looked up at him, fixing him with her dark eyes. "That is what you're staring at, correct?"
Yes,
he said, shifting a bit uncomfortably in his seat.
I did not mean to embarrass you.
"Embarrass?" She stared at him as if he'd just spoken a word in some bizarre foreign tongue. "I do not embarrass. It is understandable that you know nothing of the idic, but do you know nothing of Vulcans at all?"
I know of Vulcans, said Worf stiffly. You're said to prize logic above all else, to be very disciplined and totally without emotion.
"Not precisely," she said. "If we were truly without emotion, no discipline would be required. We control our emotions so that they do not interfere with other pursuits. Logic is of paramount importance. It is all we need."
Really?
Worf was not remotely convinced.
What does your logic tell you of me, then?
She did not hesitate. "Your parents were killed while you were young. You were adopted by a Starfleet officer, raised on a farming planet, then on Earth, and now you and your adopted brother are on your way to Starfleet Academy." Worf's jaw dropped in amazement.
How did you know all that?
She tapped the data pad she'd been studying. "I've memorized the specifics on all incoming cadets. Since there is only one Klingon listed, and since this shuttle is bound for the Academy, logic dictates that you are Worf Rozhenko. That would be Simon?" She pointed in the direction of Worf's brother.
Yes.
"Ah." They regarded each other for a moment, and then Worf said,
What is an idic?
"A Vulcan term," she said. "A philosophy of spiritual oneness. The actual Vulcan word is pronounced more along the lines of idik. Humans have transliterated it into IDIC, claiming that it stands for infinite diversity and infinite combinations. A convenient mnemonic memory device, simplistic but fairly accurate."
What is your name?
She raised an eyebrow. "Is that of interest to you?" He shrugged. "Salida," she told him. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She went back to her pad, and Worf quickly realized that she saw no logical reason to continue the conversation. He glanced out the window. They had reached the upper atmosphere, the Earth spinning below them. By attaining such a high altitude, they would be able to use Earth's rotation to bring them to their destination that much faster. He called up to the shuttle pilot.
Is it permissible to stand up?
"Stand up, walk around, do handstands if you want," said the pilot. "But in 10 minutes, I want you buckled back up for landing." Worf nodded acknowledgement, then got up out of his seat and moved next to where Simon was seated. Simon was still staring in fascination at the red-headed boy.
What is he doing?
Worf asked Simon in a low voice. Simon shook his head. No clue. You ask him. Undaunted, Worf reached over and tapped the boy's shoulder.
You,
he said, without polite preamble.
What are you doing?
The redhead looked at him. When?
Just now.
Talking to you. Worf's eyes narrowed suspiciously. His first inclination was to suspect that the lad was trying to antagonize him, but he was staring at Worf with such a deadpan expression that it was impossible to tell.
I meant before, when you were touching your nose in the window and drawing numbers on the window.
Oh, that. Abstract thinking, thinking things, spatial coordinates, relations, paradox, the having one.
Having one?
Worf was beginning to feel utterly lost. Let's say you have a distance to travel in a straight line on a single plane, said the redhead. He had such a strange look in his eyes that Worf expected the twin orbs to be rotating in opposite directions from each other just about any time. From point A to point B, and you travel half the distance, and then you travel half the remaining distance, and then half of that remaining distance, and so on and so on. Then what?
Then what? Simon asked from behind Worf.
You'd never get there, said the redhead. You'd just keep covering smaller and smaller distances. Why? A paradox. A question with no answer. Well, not all questions without answers are paradoxes, like what rhymes with orange? There's no answer to that. But that's not a paradox. That's just an annoying question. Do you like oranges? He stared at them intently as if he just posed a question of life and death importance. Worf and Simon slowly nodded. He raised a finger and said thoughtfully, if a tree fell in a forest and no one were around, then who would care? Worf opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again. Simon seemed likewise stumped. You know what I think? Continued the redhead, apparently not caring if he got an answer to any of his previous questions, or even forgetting them completely. I think there's something strange that the opposite of antimatter isn't promatter. I think that should be changed for clarity's sake.
Who are you?
Asked Worf in confusion. Mark McHenry, he said. Who are you?
Simon and Worf Rozhenko,
said Simon. Which one is which?
I'm Simon, that's Worf,
Simon told him. Once again he and Worf exchanged looks.
I am surprised you could not guess, said Worf dryly. One human name, one Klingon name. It should be fairly easy to tell us apart.
You have a Klingon name? Said McHenry. Why? Simon had to stifle a laugh. For a moment, Worf started to think that perhaps, as some sort of practical joke, Simon had put McHenry up to this.
Because I am a Klingon!
McHenry's eyes focused on Worf as if truly seeing him for the first time. Oh, yeah, he said. How long have you been a Klingon?
Buckle up,
called the pilot, sparing Worf the necessity of addressing the odd question. Worf retreated quickly to his seat. McHenry tossed off a wave and then stared at the empty air for several moments before starting to pluck at the air. Simon watched for a short time and then couldn't stand it anymore. What are you doing? Trying to catch molecules, replied McHenry. But you can't see molecules, Simon told him. I know. That way I never have to worry that I might have missed, he said, grabbing at the air. Simon wisely said nothing more. Chapter 2. The shuttlecraft made a low pass over the Golden Gate Bridge, and moments later angled down to the official landing pad of Starfleet Academy. Worf's face was pressed against the window, gaping. He had heard for so long his father's descriptions of the several buildings that made up the Academy, a fabulous combination of elegance and simplicity. It gleamed white against the noonday sun, looking as pristine and new as if it had been erected that very day instead of decades earlier. He glanced at his classmates. Salida barely gave the Academy a glance, but she did give a quick nod of approval. McHenry, for his part, didn't even seem to notice it. He was suddenly very intent on studying the whorls on his fingertips. And Simon? For a moment, Worf thought that Simon looked a little nervous, but the thought was ridiculous, of course. Simon's whole life had prepared him for this moment. He was the best, the brightest that the Rozhenko family had to offer. Indeed, Worf had already mentally steeled himself for living in the shadow of his brother's sure-to-be brilliant career. Worf would simply do the best he could, and that would have to be enough. The shuttle landed smoothly, and moments later, Worf was the first to emerge from the craft. Nearby, he saw other shuttlecrafts that had landed, disgorging their passengers out onto the grounds that had been trod by such Starfleet legends as Robert April, Matt Decker, James Kirk, and Rachel Garrett. The air was much warmer here in San Francisco. Worf breathed in deeply, but it seemed insubstantial somehow, as if the local atmosphere had no character. He was long accustomed to the biting sting that Russian air seemed to carry with it. And then, off to his left, he heard a curse. The words were not familiar, but the tone most definitely was. Moreover, he was quite certain that it had been directed at him. Slowly he turned his great head and found himself eye to eye with a Brickar. As was the case with all of his species, the Brickar had no hair anywhere on his body. As was the custom when in casual dress, the Brickar was barefoot. He wore pants that were of a shiny black material, some sort of animal hide, Worf suspected. He also wore a black tunic that hung open. His arms were powerful and muscled. He was tridigital, his hands ending in 3 long fingers, 2 in a V shape, accompanied by an opposable thumb. In contrast to the rest of his rugged appearance, the hands looked relatively delicate. This, however, was deceptive, for they were as powerful as the rest of him. His skin was dusky brown, with highlights of pure ebony. The actual surface of his skin was rock-like, substantiating the renowned Brickarian durability. Nowhere was this more evident than in the shape and style of his skull. It looked squared, many-faceted, like a rough diamond. His ears were small holes in the sides of his head, and his nose was 2 vertical parallel slits that started between his eyes and ran to just above his mouth. His eyes were black and glittered with contempt. It was clear that he was a new arrival since his bundle was at his feet. "So," he said slowly, in that deliberate way that all Brickar had, "the rumors were true. A Klingon in our midst." Worf was about to bite off a sharp reply, but then he saw Simon making a calming gesture. "Go slow. Don't let anyone bait you. This isn't grammar school anymore," he seemed to be saying. "That is correct," Worf replied after a moment. The Brickar's face twisted in undisguised disgust. "It's just my luck," he said. "I finally make it to the Academy, and now is when they decide to toss admission requirements out the window and let anyone in." Worf's fellow passengers had now emerged from the shuttle. Other students, overhearing the exchange, were drifting in their direction. Worf was feeling extremely uncomfortable at that moment. Usually when Worf felt uncomfortable, he vented that feeling by hitting something, usually an inanimate object, but there was nothing else around, and the Brickar was beginning to look awfully tempting. That, however, was no way to make a first impression. Salida, observing the exchange the way a scientist would watch a cell splitting, said, "I am unaware of any lessening of requirements for attendance, Brickar. However, were there any such, it might explain the presence of excessively belligerent individuals. Yourself, perhaps?" The Brickar cast her a furious glance that did not disturb the young Vulcan woman in the slightest. "This isn't your affair, Vulcan," he snapped. "I have no quarrel with you." Now Simon stepped in. "And you have none with Worf either," he said firmly. "Worf, let's go." Simon took his brother firmly by the arm, and at first Worf allowed himself to be led away, but the Brickar was not about to let it slide. He followed them and said, "How appropriate. The Klingon dog, allowing himself to be led around. All you need is a leash." Worf shook Simon loose and turned to face the Brickar. "And all you need is a muzzle," he snapped. Now more cadets were clustering around, aware that something was going on, but now Worf took no notice of them. "What is your problem, anyway, Brickar?" he demanded. "My problem," shot back the Brickar, "is that all Klingons know how to do is invade, to attack, to grab territory, to insert themselves where no one wants them. If the Klingons hadn't come crawling to the Federation 50 years ago..." "We did not crawl," said Worf, fury boiling over. "You did," said the Brickar. "Came crawling for help, and started a peace initiative. And then, when you were back on your feet, you thought nothing of stabbing the Federation in the back.
It was not like that,
Worf snarled through gritted teeth.
Worf, calm down,
shouted Simon. He tried to pull on Worf's arm again, but the Klingon's strength was far superior, and this time Worf wasn't allowing himself to be led away. The Brickar was relentless. It was exactly like that. Federation allies where it suits your purposes. Enemies when you want something. Taking over planets, intruding yourselves where nobody wants you.
I am as entitled to be here as you are.
Only because no one in Starfleet was smart enough to say no. No one was certain who threw the first punch, including Worf and the Brickar. One moment they were arguing, their shouting faces mere inches away from each other, and the next moment they had slammed into each other, wrestling, shoving, and grabbing. Worf landed on top, and he brought his fist back and punched the Brickar as hard as he could. It was like hitting granite. Worf fought down the reflex to yelp in pain. In fact, he hit the Brickar again as hard as he could, and hoped that the result wasn't going to be that he broke his own fingers. The blow was not without effect. For a moment, the Brickar seemed dazed, but then he rallied and struck back. Worf practically flew backward and hit the ground. Now the Brickar was up and charging, but he moved slower than Worf, who twisted out of his way, avoiding the attack. His legs speared out, snagging the Brickar by the ankles, and the larger cadet went down. Worf lunged at him, and they rolled over and over, struggling and shouting at each other. Simon tried to make himself heard over the noise, but he was not at all successful. The other cadets were bellowing far too loudly and drowning him out.
"Worf, for crying out loud!"
he called, but his voice was merely one of many lost in the chaos. The security guards, however, were able to make themselves heard with extreme ease. They shoved their way through the collected cadets.
"What the blazes is going on here?"
the foremost guard was calling. They had their phasers out, ready for anything. Nevertheless, they were not entirely prepared for the sight of two would-be Starfleet cadets, one Brickar, one Klingon, pounding on each other on the grounds of the Academy. The other cadets turned away as if suddenly concerned that their mere presence might be enough to get them thrown out of the Academy before they'd even had a chance to start. The guards surrounded the combatants and pulled them apart. It was no easy feat because, pound for pound, both Worf and his opponent were capable of giving a good fight to any of the guards. But the two of them were drastically outnumbered, and besides that, being surrounded by a small sea of red security uniforms had a rather intimidating effect on them. Within moments, order had been restored.
"Come on,"
said one of the guards, in a voice that indicated there would be no contradiction tolerated. Nevertheless, Simon tried to intervene.
"Sir, he's my brother, sir."
The guard stopped and looked at confusion at Worf and the Brickar. Since neither of them seemed a likely candidate, the guard asked, "Which one?"
"Him,"
Simon said, pointing to Worf.
"And he was provoked. I saw the—"
"Doesn't matter," said the guard firmly. "We let the commanding officer sort this out. But are you here to start as a cadet, son?"
"Yes, sir."
"In that case," said the guard, "I'm sure you have a passing familiarity with the concept of following an order, and I am ordering you now to move out of the way." Simon looked at Worf helplessly, and Worf made a small gesture, waving Simon off. He mouthed, "It will be all right." Not that he particularly believed it, as the guards led him off to the CO's office. The one consolation he took from all this was that the Brickar was in as much trouble as he was. None of which was going to make it any easier, he thought, when he wound up being shipped home in record time. Who would have thought, when his parents brought him to the shuttle pad shortly after the wonderful farewell breakfast his mother had whipped up, that he'd be back home in time for dinner?